Hi there, welcome. Today we're going to be finding a percentage of a whole. Specifically, we're going to be finding 35% of 80. So before we start, I want us to think about what the answer has to be, like what reasonable answers are. So for example, the answer must be less than 80 because you're finding a percent of 80, so it's got to be less than 80. And then since I know that 35% is less than 50%, let's see, 50% is 40, right? Because half of 80 is 40. So since 35% is less, that means that our answer has to be less than 40. So let's keep that in mind. If we get a number that's greater than 40, then we know that that won't work and that we have the wrong answer. Okay. So the first way we're going to talk about this is using unit rates. So if you like unit rates, great, stay here. And if you don't like unit rates, then you can skip ahead to a different part of the video. So for unit rates, we start with what we know. We know that 100% is 80. So I want to get to 35%. So I have to think about like what are some helpful percentages that I can use to get there. 1% is always going to be super helpful for me to get to a different percent. So to get from what I know to 1%, to get from 100% to 1%, I have to divide by 100. So if I'm doing that on that side of the equation, I have to do it on that side as well. So I'm going to take my calculator. You might know this in your head, but 800 divided by 100 is 8/10. Awesome. So now that I know what 1% is, I can use that to find what 35% is. So let me think, how can I like scale up going from 1% to 35%? I can multiply by 35. And if I do that over there, I have to do that over here on this side of the equation as well. So I'm just taking 8/10, multiplying by 35, and that gives me 28. So 35% is 28. And hey, that's less than 40. So my answer seems reasonable. So 40%, whoopsie, let's try that again. 35% of 80 is 28. Okay, so that's one way using unit rates. Another way that you can use unit rates that might be easier for you, I don't know, is you can find 5% because 5% goes into 100% and it goes into 35, which is going to be our goal, right? So if you find 5% first, you can find 35%. So how to go from 100 to 5%, how many times do I have to divide it? I have to divide 100 by 20. 100 divided by 20 gives me 5%. So I also have to do it over here, divided by 20. 80 divided by 20 gives me 4. So I know 5% of 80 is 4. From there, how can I get from 5% to 35%? I can multiply by 7. So I have to do the same thing over here. So 4 times 7, that gives me 28. And that matches. That's perfect. Okay, so that's using unit rates. You're using helpful percentages that you know in order to find the percentage that you need to get, 35%. Okay, so that's one strategy. Another strategy we can use is proportions. For the proportions, let's see how I can show you this. Remember, my answer's got to be less than 40 now that I'm covering that up. Okay, so I need a part over the whole. Now when I look at the information I have, I know the percent out of 100, and I know the whole. I know that 80 is the whole. So when I set up my proportion, I set up 35 out of 100, because that's the percent out of 100. And now for the part over the whole, I know 80 is the whole. I'm looking for the part. I'm looking for what is 35 out of 100 when it comes to 80. What's 35% of 80, okay? So I'm gonna cross multiply. This is just a trick. What happens is I do 35 times 80. I'll write that over here for you. and I'm going to do 100 times x. So what that gives me, when I use my calculator, is 2,800 equals 100x. Now remember, you're trying to solve for x. You're trying to figure out what x is, so you can divide on both sides by 100. 100 divided by 100 is just 1. So what you have left is 1x, or just x. And then when I divide these two numbers, a trick you know is that if the numbers both have zeros, you can cancel out the zeros, and you're left with 28 over 1. Or in other words, that's just 28. So again, that's the same answer I was getting before, and it's still less than 40. So that makes sense, and that works for me. Okay. Sorry you couldn't see all of that. Okay, so those are two strategies. I'm going to give you two more. A third strategy that you can use is an operation. Basically, you can multiply or divide by the decimal itself, okay? So I want us to try it both ways just to see what happens and see which answer makes the most sense. So we're going to do 80 times 35 hundredths because 35% is equal to 35 hundredths. This is hundredths out of 100, and then percents are out of 100. So these are equivalent, okay? So we're going to multiply, and we're going to divide as well, and we're going to see which one gives us an answer that's less than 40 or even less than 80, okay? So I'm going to do 80 times 35 hundredths. That gives me 28. And I'm going to do 80 divided by 35 hundredths. Oh, and that gives me a really big number, 228 and about 57 hundredths. The number keeps going though. So I know that I don't want to divide because that didn't give me an answer that made sense. So when I multiplied though, my answer was 28, and that seemed to make sense based on the fact that it's less than 40. Okay, last strategy is we're going to use a number line. I like this number line strategy because I'm a visual learner and I can visualize where the different numbers go on my number line, okay? So I'm going to draw it pretty big so that I can visualize everything. On the bottom are going to be my percents. You can do this differently if you want, but then on the top, I have my whole numbers, right? So 80 is 100%. That means that about in the middle, 50% is going to be equal to 40 when you cut the line in half, right? I'm going to start cutting things into tenths because my goal is to figure out, like, what am I counting up by each time? Now, obviously, I'm counting up by 40, but I want to see some smaller numbers so that it's easier for me to figure out what 35% is. So that's 10, 20, 30, 40, so 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, and this is what I'm trying to get. I'm trying to get to 35%. I also have 60, 70, 80, 90. Maybe I didn't space that out very well, but that's okay. Let me see if you guys can see that okay. Oh yeah, you can see that just fine. Okay, so if that's the case, then maybe I'll just look at this bottom half. 0 to 40, we split it up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times if I ignore this little part. So 40 split into fifths, 5 equal groups. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 40 divided by 5, that's 8. So I think we're counting up by 8. So that'll be 8, 16, 24, 32, oh yeah, and 40. And that works out really well. Let me check this way too. So going up by 8, it's 48, 56, 64, 72, and 80. That worked out perfectly. Okay, so I know that 35 is in here. I know that it's going to be between 24 and 32. That means that 5%, this little halfway increase, instead of going all the way up by 8, if I'm only going halfway, then half of 8 is going to be 4. So what this really is 24 plus another 4. So 35% is 28 if I'm just counting up by that. You could also count by fives if you wanted to make this even smaller. You could count by 5% instead, but this was a little bit less work for me, so I went with it. So I know that 35% is 28. 35% of 80 is 28. So those are 4 different strategies that you can use for finding 35% of 80. What I really need you to pay attention to, though, is what answers make sense. So you know you should be getting something less than 40, or even just knowing that it has to be less than 80 is really going to help you avoid mistakes and get the correct answer. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.